I want to delve further into exactly what it was that women were experiencing, and they're trying to go to medical school. They just wanted to study medicine. And here there's men throwing tobacco spit at them. There's throwing spitballs, mud, rotten eggs. I wanted to know more, and I wanted to peel back the curtain and see exactly what it was that inspired them to keep going in the face of all that.
Sylvia and me. Sylvia and me. Sylvia.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Beckerman, host of the podcast series Sylvia and Me, conversations with extraordinary, inspiring women.
Hi, I'm Olivia Campbell. I'm a freelance journalist for about 10 years now. I mostly write about women, history, and medicine. I have 3 sons, and I live outside of Philadelphia with them and my husband and our cat. And welcome to Sylvia and Me.
Olivia, thank you so much for being here with me today. And you mentioned history, medicine, women. Well, that kind of brings us to the title of your first nonfiction and your very recently published book, Women in White Coats: How the First Women Doctors Changed the World. And, in today's world, we have the first woman vice president. We have so many women in Congress. We have women who are, doing things that we never really thought women would be doing. But you even took it a step further, and you looked all the way back to the 1800s. And can you tell us why did you even think about women and doctors? What was the inspiration? What motivated you to take 3 years and really do research?
I first heard about this topic I read about 2 riots. There was a riot in Philadelphia, and then about a year later, there was a riot in Edinburgh, Scotland. And these are both in the Victorian era in the 1800s. And they were both almost exactly the same issue. It was men throwing temper tantrums, throwing violent fits when women dared to appear beside them in the classroom at medical school. So I said, okay, these 2 are too similar. There's something going on here. I want to delve further into exactly what it was that women were experiencing, and they're trying to go to medical school. They just wanted to study medicine. And here there's men throwing tobacco spit at them. There's throwing spitballs, mud, rotten eggs, covering their dresses with junk, chasing them home after the class. They let a loose sheep into the exam room in one case. It's the intolerance, the harassment that they dealt with. I wanted to know more, and I wanted to peel back the curtain and see exactly what it was that inspired them to keep going in the face of all that.
Well, one of the amazing things, if you think about it, is women have always been healers. They've taken care of their family. You watch them in any of the old movies, really taking care of any patient, anyone who's sick. And yet, back in the 1800s, women were really dying from illnesses that could have been prevented, dying because they didn't want to go to a male doctor, and they weren't really treated properly. So you started talking about this woman, Elizabeth Blackwell. Tell us a little bit more about Elizabeth Blackwell.
She's pretty well known in this country, but the story I tell of her is not as well known, I don't think. I don't think people realize that she went to London and started a whole other medical school for women there. But she's the first licensed woman, MD, to practice in America. She had a terrible time getting into medical school. She applied to so many schools and just got turned down merely, on the sake of being a woman. She finally gets into a school. She gets accepted as a joke. So she applies to Geneva College, just a small country school in New York. And they think, the administrators, they're like, okay, we don't want to be the ones to say no to a woman. So we're going to let the student decide if she can come and go here or not. So they put it to the students. They say, okay, should we admit this woman who's applied? And the students think it's a joke from a neighboring college, that they're pulling their leg, and they're like, oh sure, yeah, she can come to our school. And here a few weeks later, Elizabeth Blackwell appears. She's a real person. She's tenacious. She's gonna, take all the classes she can take. She's not gonna take any guff from anyone. The men treated her okay there. She had a pretty decent experience at college. She had a few instances where people would throw paper airplanes, or she was asked not to come to anatomy class when they were discussing something delicate. But she kind of pushed back and said, no, I'm going to go to class, and I'm not going to take these disturbances. I'm going to get my degree and be done. And then she went to Europe to get advanced training. She went to Paris. She went to England to study at hospitals there, because really that was one of the biggest problems. Is first you had to pry your way into medical school, but then if you could manage to do that, there was nowhere to train after that. There was nowhere to do an internship that would accept a woman. So most of them went to Europe, most of these women.
And so, in fact, I just want to interrupt you for a second. She went and looked for, she wanted to become a doctor. And you tell the story of, we all have heard about Florence Nightingale, famous nurse. And they were at some point friends, but they had a huge disagreement. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so they met when she first went to London to train at a hospital there, and they were great friends. And this is when Florence is feeling very stifled and stuck at home as a daughter and future wife, and she doesn't want this kind of life. So I think Elizabeth Blackwell really inspires her to kind of pursue her dream. And then when Elizabeth Blackwell comes back a few years later, Florence is famous by this point for her work in Crimean War, and she actually is the one who writes a letter of recommendation that gets Elizabeth Blackwell's name on the medical register so she can practice medicine in England. So she's technically the first woman, even though Elizabeth Garrett is the first practicing woman who earned her degree in England. Elizabeth Blackwell is actually the first one on the medical register legally allowed to practice in England. But so when Elizabeth comes back the second time to England, it's about 10 years later, she wants to establish a hospital for women with Florence Nightingale. So she wants to use the money, the fund that the public has raised for Florence, to open a hospital where she would have a college where women could train to be doctors and nurses. And Florence is like, no one's going to go for that. We don't have enough money for that. First of all, she wanted to open a big place out in the country. She's like, no, let's just open a little school attached to a hospital that's already existing, and it's just going to be for training nurses. That's it. We're not going to train doctors, women. So basically Florence didn't think that women should be doctors. They should just be nurses, and that's fine. So that's where they had a big kind of falling out. They never really recovered their relationship after that. Elizabeth Blackwell comes back to America just upset that Florence couldn't get back, have her back of this idea of opening a medical school for women.
And that's the thing. You even had a woman who had done something with her life who couldn't imagine women going any further. It's that cap. Yes, women are supposed to be nurses, not doctors. So we have Elizabeth Blackwell, but Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, one of the first to get a medical degree. And then you talk about two other women. Lizzie Anderson, Garrett Anderson, and Sophia Jex-Blake. So how are these three women connected?
The more I researched, the more points of overlap and intersect I found. It was really fascinating. I chose these three women because they worked together to found the Women's Medical School in London, the first one in the UK. But the more I dug, the more overlap I found, and it was fascinating to me. So the original is Elizabeth Blackwell, of course. A biography is written of her in a women's magazine in England, and Lizzie Garrett reads it. So that's her first introduction, Lizzie's introduction to the idea of a woman being a doctor. Then a few months later, Elizabeth Blackwell is touring England, giving lectures, talking about how great it is to have a career as a woman, how great it is to be fulfilled in a job, and why not medicine. So Lizzie goes to these lectures and she's very inspired by this. She gets to meet Elizabeth Blackwell afterward, and she's like, oh, wait a minute, maybe this is what I want to do, because she's really bored at home and, you know, waiting to be a wife, same kind of deal as Florence Nightingale. And that's not what she wants. She wants to study. She wants to busy her brain. She wants to have a purpose. So then Elizabeth Blackwell is also the reason why Sophia Jex-Blake is interested in medicine, but in a more roundabout way. So Elizabeth Blackwell establishes a women's medical college and a women's hospital in New York. And one of her co-creators there is kind of her protege, is Marie. And Marie, very soon after they establish it, Marie moves to Boston to kind of recreate this. So there's a women's medical college in Boston, and then she starts a hospital, women's hospital in Boston also. So Sophia Jex-Blake is already friends with Lizzie Garrett. They kind of move in the same circles in London. They don't exactly get along. Sophia is very bold, very brash. She kind of says whatever's on her mind. She has the greatest comebacks ever. I love Sophia. To have that quick wit, her mind, oh, it's incredible. And to not care about what, you know, anyone thinks, when just to say your mind. But not everyone, you know, likes that about her at the time. So Sophia's dream, even when she is working with helping Lizzie Garrett to try and get into these medical schools, she doesn't really think about becoming a doctor herself yet. It's when Sophia goes to America. Sophia's big dream is to open a school, just a school for girls, not necessarily a medical school. She wants to open a school for women because she had a terrible time at school, and she wants other smart, boisterous girls to have a place where they can be themselves. Like she wasn't allowed to be. So she goes to America on this tour of colleges, because America has a few colleges at this point that allow women, that train women in co-ed spaces or just for women. So she goes to Oberlin College, which is one of the oldest places that accepts women in the US. And she goes to a couple other places. She's talking to female academics, just kind of about what it looks like to have a women's college, to train women at an advanced level. So then her trip starts and ends in Boston, right? So meets these women that had worked with Elizabeth Blackwell and then moved to Boston. So she is inspired by the women at the women's hospital in Boston then to finally become a doctor. And then she actually attends Elizabeth Blackwell's medical college in New York for a few months, but then her father passes away and she has to go back to England to be with her family. But yeah, the more I dug, the more overlap, the more connections. There's so many points of connection, but just so none of these three women really got along. I don't think, in essence, but they had to put aside their differences and their ideas about how to be successful at allowing women to finally be accepted as doctors, to build this school for women, to make it happen, to say, okay, we don't get along, you're not the best person for this job, I don't think you're doing it the right way, but okay, we're going to do this, we're going to make a school and we're going to make it successful.
So what was it like, medical school back then? Was it as structured and as long as it is now, with residency and medical school and internship and so on? What was it like back then?
I was utterly shocked by how little medical schooling you went through at the time. I mean, so this is the point when America is like kind of really turning it over from apprenticeships and going into, you know, you have to go to college to get a degree. The year that Elizabeth goes to college is the year that the American Medical Association is born. So basically this is kind of when we start to take things seriously. But even then, it's only like 2 years of school and like an apprenticeship or residency somewhere, and then you write a thesis, and that's kind of it. It's basically like an undergraduate degree in America, which really surprised me. There were men graduating with a medical degree that had never attended a real birth. So there's men showing up at births, and you know, they know about as much as the woman knows, and these poor women have to deal with that. But in the UK, it seemed a little more stringent. There was like 3.5 or 4 years of college. But it was still basically like an undergrad degree. And a lot of times these students just weren't paying attention. They were just kind of there to be there. They were really a boisterous bunch. They liked to fight and drink. And it was just shocking how like medicine was not how we see it today. It was not a prestigious degree. It was not a great job. It's what you went into if you failed at being a lawyer or a politician or a priest, basically.
So So if that were the case, why did these women push so hard to become doctors?
I think one of the things that a lot of them said after the riots was, now we kind of see why we're needed more than ever. We see how these men are acting, how far these men will go. These are the kind of men that are going to be treating patients in a few years. You know, this is what we're dealing with. This is why we need a better quality of person going to medical school. Women need to have women that they can talk to, that they can trust, so that they can tell all their problems to, and really be understood about what's wrong.
So, and they opened the school. How many women actually became doctors out of, this school? Did it catch on? Were there a lot of students, or was it just something that they catered to, and kind of had to really put out some PR to get, women in?
For the women's hospital in New York, they were turning people away, patients away. There were people that wanted to deliver their babies there. They had way more patients than they could handle. I think the school was very who they would accept. They tried to model their school on the European model of, a little bit more stringent, more requirements. Basically anybody could get into medical school that wanted to if you were a man in America. So you just kind of had to like put your name in there, and then you'd get in. So they kind of tried to raise the bar. There were definitely they had enough students in New York, and they definitely had enough students in London, and it caught on. There's more and more every year for sure. I don't think there was a problem. They had other problems with the school, like they needed funding. They needed, to have a place where they could take their MD exams at the end that was like allowed them to then have their license to practice. So that it was getting these institutions to accept them that was the problem. It wasn't that they didn't have enough students, not at all.
Well, that seems so amazing. What was it about these three women that really pulled you to them? There had to have been, other women. What specifically pulled you to even start researching? And I know that it took you 3 years of steady research. So how did you go about? You had heard of Elizabeth Blackwell. Where did you start?
I think the original pitch for this book had a lot more women. There's so many more women that I wanted to cover, because there's a women's medical school that was in Philadelphia that's near me that I was like, oh, I should focus on this because it's nearby. But then that ended up being the part I cut, and focusing on these three women in the UK instead. I just wanted to go back to the UK. That's all. I lived there for 3 years. This is my excuse to
Okay.
get back.
But in the meantime, you wound up finding some really interesting, unknown stories about these women and what they went through.
I think I was really intrigued because I had never heard of this particular story. Like I said, nobody really talks about how Elizabeth Blackwell went to London and did this all over again. She did it in New York. Yes, we know that, but we don't hear about this other school in London. And also Sophia, she's the one that really drew me into this story, because she was in the riot in Edinburgh. She was one of the 7 women who were trying to go to their exam with the men, and just there was this huge riot. So she's part of this Edinburgh 7, as they're known. But it was her idea to establish the school in London. She writes to the other 2 Elizabeths and says, you're like the known women in medicine. You have to do this with me, or I'm not going to succeed. It's going to look really bad for me if you're not participating in this. You're not condoning this. So you have to do this with me. As much as we don't get along, you have to do this with me. And then so they start working on the school, and then as soon as Sophia goes to Ireland to take her MD exam, while she's gone, they have a meeting and decide that she's not the right kind of person to be, heading the school, to be the public face of the school. She's not a good ambassador. She's too angry. She, says whatever's on her mind. So that's not good for us as a public institution. So we're gonna kind of kick her out while she's gone. So this London Medical School for Women is known as Elizabeth Garrett School, because Elizabeth Garrett took it over. She became the dean, and she built it from there. But it wasn't her school; it was Sophia's school. So that kind of that story really drew me in as well. This idea that this unremembered person who it was their idea, but they got pushed out just because they had not so great personality.
And one of the things I know that you've noted is that there wasn't a lot of information on Sophia because she had instructions after she died that her notes should be torn up and thrown away. So how did you even, where did you find this information?
I was very lucky in that Sophia herself wrote a lot. She wrote a lot of essays talking about, she like wrote essays about the history of women in medicine. She wrote, basically an autobiography sort of deal about what happened during her time at Edinburgh University. A lot of the newspapers covered it. She was kind of a newspaper darling because she was so outspoken, because at public meetings, she would just, go on, start talking about how she was treated and whose fault it was. And it was this person, that person. So the media loved to report on her talks, her hijinks, her antics, but her partner, Margaret, actually, after Sophia died, Margaret was also an author. She wrote many novels and she was a doctor. They were doctors together. So Margaret wrote a biography of Sophia using her diaries and her letters before she destroyed them. So it was not all of them, but she took key passages and things like that. So basically the bulk of this biography is Sophia's words themselves. So that was definitely very helpful. I would not have been able to write this without that piece for sure. But yeah, when I went to the archives, there's essentially nothing of Sophia's there because she requested that it be destroyed upon her death. So it's really interesting to think about, when people are writing diaries and personal letters, that you don't think 100 years in the future, someone's going to be poking their nose around in that private information. But Sophia was ready. She was like, no, you're not going to have that chance. We're going to get it destroyed.
So they were the start. Where has medicine and women, where has the field taken women?
Well, what's interesting is that Lizzie Garrett's daughter actually also became a surgeon, and she and her partner established some wartime hospitals and another hospital, and they were kind of the first to pioneer women treating men as well as women treating other women. So that, this next generation, we're kind of easing the societal expectations even more. So I think that women's participation in medicine has kind of gone up and down. We've had social changes as far as like expectations of women to be in the household, that kind of thing. So our interest in having careers kind of goes along the flow of what kind of expecting at the time, where patriarchy is at, I guess. But so it's gone up and down. And right now, for the past 2 years or so, there's been more women medical students than men. So we're kind of tipping the scales finally. The problem is, as you go further up in line there, further down the line of education or of leadership, is that where the numbers of women really start to dwindle. So we definitely need to work on how, medicine is still many ways a boys' club, especially many specialties. A lot of sexism still, a lot of inflexibility with, caregiving needs that often fall on women. So there's a long way to go yet, but we're making strides, I think.
Well, the pandemic hurt or help?
I think it helped show the importance of women doctors. I mean, I firmly believe that we have research to show that women are better doctors. And without these Victorian women, that there wouldn't be doctors to welcome you into the hospital right now. Wouldn't be women pulmonologists to treat you, to help you, to be developing vaccines. But at the same time, you have a lot of women have been pushed out of their careers because of the childcare, crisis. Basically, schools being closed, remote schooling. Someone's got to be home. You got to choose between your career and your kids' schooling, basically, right now. So I think there's a lot of early career people that have caregiving duties, people with young children or with older parents that are really struggling right now, and that just kind of lost their career. And it's something we lost as a society to lose them.
So what do you hope people take away from this unbelievable book?
I hope people realize that sexism has never been okay, and someone has always stood up to say this is not okay. We like to excuse things back in history as, oh, that's just the way it was done. That's how it was. But there's always been, as long as there's been racism and sexism, there's been someone to stand up and say, no, this isn't okay. It's not how it should be done. I think this story is as infuriating as it is inspiring to see all that these women went through, and that they never once quit, and that they not only did they get their medical degrees, but they made sure that other women could also get their medical degrees in the future too.
So I was going to ask you, what would you like to tell our listeners? You basically said it just now, but do you have something more succinct that you want to? What would you like people to take away from our conversation?
I think just don't give up. Like even in the face of harassment and sexism, and I know it can be bleak at times, especially for women in medicine, experiencing harassment. But just looking back at these examples of all that they were facing, and the fact they could still overcome that, is just incredible to me.
So what are you working on now? Anything in particular?
I'm supposed to be developing 3 possible new book ideas. I have 2 so far, so I need to think of the next one just to pitch to my editor, see which one they want me to develop further and work on more. So I'm just hoping that my book sells well enough to sell my next book. But anything to do with kind of hidden histories of women in science is all my bag. I love it.
So, Women in White Coats, How the First Women Doctors Changed the World. So, Olivia, where can people find out more about you, or are you on social media? Where can they find you?
On Twitter, I'm at Olivia Campbell. On my website is ocampbellwriter.com. And if anybody wants a signed book, they're selling copies at newtownbookshop.com. That's in Newtown, Pennsylvania.
Olivia, I thank you so much for being here. And, your book can be found on all independent, bookstores, online, and Amazon, of course. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You can find us on all of your popular podcast platforms. And of course, our website, sylviame.com. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay tuned.